Welcome back. Episode 6, Wing It Podcast, goosedigital.com. Who do we have today?
Riley Murray.
Robin Kroll.
Kevin Butler.
Michael Turksani. Okay, hard on the heels of episode 5.
We're back.
Hard on the heels.
Wow.
We're going to talk about going back to the customer journeys. We talked about in episode 5, why it's important to think about that, and what is it? First of all, what the hell is a customer journey? So we're not going to get into that. Why it's important to do it. And then now what we're going to talk about, because that one took 30 minutes, is how to go about planning the customer journey and what would you do? How would you approach that in your business? So while we're in the throes of this, we do this pretty much every day of the week. So why don't I turn it over to you, Robin, to sort of kick off? How would you recommend people get this process going?
I think one of the first things to consider is who you want to be sitting at the table, right? So, thinking of every department where there is a customer touch point or interaction. And that's how you figure out who sits at the table. So to me, that's the first thing that you would take a look at.
Now we're going to assume for the moment that it's a priority. The business, everybody just agrees that we need to do this. So how do we go about doing it? I think having all those stakeholders at the table is definitely a good place to start. What about where in the journey to start? Customers sort of take on multiple paths, as we said last time. They could be unique to them, but where should you start?
I think you're almost asking a deeper question in where in your customer journeys is your business. Mm-hmm. Like businesses coming into marketing aren't starting from scratch. These aren't people you're just trying to get that raw customer into your door. These are people who you want your raw customers coming into your door, but you also want people who might already be halfway through that journey, whatever that is up until this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the key word there is journeys, not journey.
Yeah.
And this idea that there's all sorts of different ones, right? I think what I would probably do with all the right stakeholders in the room is map out a net new to what we think is probably the very end of that entire life cycle. And then from there, I think you can go and say, okay, well, we know what we'd have to do from like an acquisition all the way through. But if you had this whole charted journey, you could go and sort of through your database. Maybe it's existing customers, maybe it's prospects that are halfway along that journey, and sort of try to plot them against that and say, oh, they're actually, halfway through, they're on the tail end of things or whatever. Then other journeys from there can be built as a result.
Yeah, and I think there's also a concept of prioritizing, right? So, hopefully after listening to episode 5, everybody, has bought into the idea of the value of the customer journey, and that really is end to end. But if you think from an organizational perspective, you always have to prioritize what you're going to start with. So you might have 5 different journeys, but this particular journey, so it might be your new customer journey might be your priority. And then maybe if you see what we're actually losing a lot of business, that the customer re-engagement is another prioritized journey. So that might be sort of a next step after you sort of have that big picture and say, we're going to start chopping it up into pieces.
Yeah,
and that's
right.
How we're going to tackle it.
I think you might have where's the biggest bang for your buck, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody's going to want to grow their business. They're all going to want new acquisitions or new leads or new whatever that happens to be. But if you said, okay, well, it's going to be a process either way, to your point, what's the best place to start? If you have to start going and touching several departments, they might say, well, we happen to have a 95% reactivation rate, and there's not a ton, like we can grab value there, right, but it's not going to be unless we're cutting 100 heads kind of thing, or half the business. It's like, I'm not sure that's, or they might say, actually, it turns out that, to your point, reactivations are pretty difficult. Everybody could use more business, but maybe that's a place where you go and say, well, maybe we should start the implementation there.
Sure, and I think one of the other things that we've seen, just speaking specifically about the leads, because really have we ever spoken to a business who hasn't said they want leads, but if you think you're going to invest all this time into building out a really solid, an acquisition journey, but if you don't have the next step properly built out, so that initial new customer or conversion, however you want to call it, all that effort for the leads.
Yep.
You're
80%
gonna
of
lose
your
them.
business comes from 20% of your current customers.
Exactly.
Right?
So maybe that's the priority in the process is onboarding, brand new customers, and you focus on that, and then you say, all right, we've got this really solid. Then we're going to take that next step, saying we're ready for to really build out that pipeline, and we've got everything in place, so we're going to be able to handle all that
A lot
extra
of new
volume.
customers. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about why to do it at the first or the last episode, and driving downstream dependencies. So when you think about the planning that goes into something like this, Kev, what are the types of things that you're mapping out, across the board, across the systems, across, the various touch points? What are how do people go and say, I'm going to sit down and do a planning session on, let's call it a new customer journey? What does that process look like?
Well, I think before you even think about tools and technologies, or even really processes, I think you just have to ask yourself, like, what is that goal? Like, what are you actually trying to do? Oh, we're trying to get someone to sign up for our new service. Okay, great. Well, then, okay. So you break that down and say, well, what are the things then that need to happen in order for someone to do that? They need to buy into what you're all about. Well, they haven't heard of you. Well, how can you leverage or showcase, ways to develop that sort of trust? And then from there, it's what are the things they'll need to see? Oh, they need to learn a bit more about, I don't know, the value props that you offer, or what it means to their business to join Kev Inc., right? And so I think that's how it starts. And then from there, you're going to sort of build on that and say, this is what we know. And, that's going to take several messages because this is a complex business and whatever else. And I think those stages start to reveal themselves as you talk this through. In our case, with the client, they know more about their business than certainly we would. And from there, I think some of those tools then just sort of naturally enter the fray, because you say, well, we would need an email to do that. We would actually need a CRM, and we need some means to be able to measure engagement or score it, or a workflow to then push from stage 1 to stage 2. And then before you know it, you've kind of got a bit of a plan here, and I think you talk it through. And then you start building some messaging. And we usually start this in Excel. And I promise anyone listening that these Excel sheets don't look very great at first, but it's the semblance of a plan. And much like episode 5's analogy of building a home or a condo, when you dig a big hole, it doesn't look very impressive either, but it's a starting point, and it's that foundation for stacking everything on top with a nice clean look and external feel once it's done. So I think that's kind of how it starts. But the biggest thing that I could say is it's not a Picasso right away. And I think the idea is someone just has to put themselves out there and say, hey, how does this look for a starting point, and let's generate discussion. And you're going to spend hours and hours
you
talking
hit on
about
you hit on a good point where it's like, you're already making the assumption that you will have a potential CRM touch point, or you will have a potential, certainly email may be things that people can understand, right? But you might have a CRM task appear, or you might have a service case reopen, or there might be some escalation that occurs under a certain condition. I think that part of the starting point is to sort of educate that those things are possible, because otherwise people rush to answers because they're not aware of what's possible.
I think that's a good point. I think so you start architecting at a high level, what's the goal, and then what has to happen to achieve that goal in meaningful milestones. And then from there, I think you ask yourself the question, so how do we get them to do that? Does a prospect have to click on a link and go somewhere in order to do something? And it's like, well, how would they do that? What would power that? Do we have that? And I think a lot of times people will say, I think we might have this, we might have that, and maybe that, or maybe that gap in terms of technology reveals itself pretty clearly, and it's okay, well, now we need to go buy a CRM or something like that.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think it's important to just identify the steps and the touches that have to happen and what those are. And then I think the technology stuff becomes a bit easier. Very rarely, if you go that way, are you going to get to a situation where you say, well, I don't know how technology would solve that problem.
And I think that's one of the, the things that when we're working with our clients is very much the partnership, because we do have a really good understanding of how technology can enable, and then the client comes to the table with that deep understanding of their business, of their industry, and we work with clients across so many different verticals that while we have a deep knowledge, they're the ones that really have that expertise, but it's that partnership working together. And the other point that I wanted to add, where you were talking about sort of those steps, and I always think of the customer journey building. It's iterative, because you're going to build one layer where you're going to say, okay, this is what the step is, what it looks like. And then you think of, okay, but actually to get from this step to the next step, this is what you have to do. And what does that experience look like? And all of those multiple steps, it might not come out in the first time that you're building a customer journey. And Kevin, you have a lot of experience with this as well. You can, I'm sure you can, hopefully you can confirm, but when I've done this process, it's multiple sessions, because the first time you're going to do it, you're going to get those first layers, you're going to come in some of the additional pieces, and then you come back to it and you start thinking, oh, well, actually, this is where you would go to the next time, and that doesn't always come out first, because there's a lot of thought process. It won't.
More often than not, it won't, and I think it's because you have to get that baseline in.
Yeah.
It's like when you watch Westworld. You have to basically get a lay of the land first before you can pay attention to the details after.
But see, I want to hear from Riley on this, because you're very quiet.
Well,
Okay.
in terms of...
But here's what I want you to not to cut in. Here's what I want you, because you've been a part of a lot of these. You've been part of pushing into, after the digital is sort of off the ground, and pushing into these analog, teams that they were used to doing things a certain way. And then, you're like, wow, that the planning process isn't so straightforward. So you think of like, what advice would you give, or how would you approach that now, knowing what you know today about pulling these departments together and how to, drive a journey conversation?
It definitely comes back to integrating a multitude of different teams, like whether you're initiating that conversation with your phone room, with your development room, with your sales room. There's so many different levels of these teams that have to work together. And in no way is that person in the big boardroom thinking about the developer wherever he's located, integrating a request a product form in an email. Like these are well, I guess that's a bad example that could be related in that regard, but to a developer integrating something in your phone room, like you don't think of those being connected. But if you look at the stages of that customer cycle, whether that's going to the website and then filling out a form, the web developer comes in that website experience. And then there's that whole step of engagement where that user is going to receive an email. They're going to start interacting. Maybe if they click on that email, that phone person is going to end up calling that customer. And there's that whole step-by-step process where the developer, that initial phase of that development project, ends up having such a big impact on that end result of that phone person being able to have a good interaction
And you have
with that
to,
customer.
you have to think through. It's like on the journey mapping, it's like, the things that are in control of the digital team, it's like, okay, well, we can fire an email at this stage or not, or we can put them to a progressive profiling form or not. We can kind of control all that aspect. But then when it's like, oh, but what do you say when you get them on the phone? We've now put this little bit of information in your CRM, which might be that last URL that this customer might be interested in, in the last 30 days. And how does he or she use that information? Is it, hey, I just saw that you clicked on this URL and creep the person out? Or is it, what's the script, right?
Well, it's definitely part of the enablement, right? In terms of you go and invest a bunch of time, money, and effort, resources, everything into building this, and a lot of thought into it, and then it'll fall down if someone doesn't know what to do with it in that
Right.
moment.
And I think also a big part of that, though, is knowing what information is attainable by each area of your company. I don't necessarily want our phone salespeople to know exactly which link in an email somebody's clicked on,
Right.
because that's not going to be useful information to that salesperson necessarily. In some cases, it absolutely will. In some cases, like you said, Michael, it's just
Could be
going to creep the
dangerous.
customer out. Yeah,
Depending
exactly.
on how it's used, right?
But again, when you talk about enablement, I'm a big believer when it comes to any kind of salesperson that you gotta, as a marketing or marketing ops, you have to arm them with all the information possible and the knowledge of that information, what it's designed for, so that they can make and do their jobs and make the best decision they can with that information. If they want to use that thing at that part of the sales stage or sales cycle, then fine. If they understand what it really is, how to use it, then you're trusting that sales rep has the skills to go and deliver what's required. Right?
Yeah, but I think when you're, and I agree with you, and I think, Robin, you touched on iterations in the planning, but also being able to have the appropriate measurements and be able to see how things are going. And I think it's,
Right.
certainly a longer term adoption in a lot of the things that we work on, whether it's, the first version of this customer journey or the first version of how we're thinking of your data and your KPIs. It seems to that you mature these things over time. And, in that case where, marketing and the team that's responsible for blowing out these journeys and, we want you to say the right things at the right time. And, okay, we think that's all going to come together. Then it's like, well, it's probably not going to come together in the first run. Like, that you're going to have 5 salespeople that get it right and 50 that don't.
But there's testing and learning that goes into this too.
Right.
So again, and we say this a lot, is when you're developing these new concepts and new processes, you're putting your best foot forward. We're coming up with what we think are the best idea at the time, but I think we're all prepared to learn from whatever transpires on those to say, oh, we can do that better moving forward. So failure is okay if you're learning from it.
It's an important thing for senior leadership to have that same perspective as
Agreed.
well,
And
right?
and that's what I'm
Yes.
saying is that I think
Yes.
what you're seeing, Riley, and what you touched on was it takes a lot of these departments to come together to even have a chance to succeed. These things need to come together under that umbrella of hopefully a strategic, mandate that we need a digital thread to run between everything. But then on top of that, fully expecting that you're not going to get it right. So a big part of like what we would do is help them provide that framework, if you will, to even go about that in their business. And then to your point, like get it coming back from it and just constantly iterating that it's, the process of implementing these journeys and changing the journeys to a point where it's actually adding value, right?
Right. One of the things we didn't mention before, but I think is pretty critical, is when you start building what this journey looks like, or journeys, and maybe it looks more like a Gantt chart, is to also identify the departments or the roles of responsible for which part of that journey, and then also the technology that's going to be used in that.
Well, that's just
With
Those
one
are
of
the-
our
those
clients,
are the
that's
right,
layers,
yeah.
right?
We're talking about literally at the granular level of, well, what's the stage inside of their CRM? Oh, it's still a lead, and we've built out 9 different stages in the lead. And I think the other interesting thing too is not to get hung up on, well, oh, this is a lead and then it gets converted to an opportunity. Like, you don't have to play by anybody's rules other than the rules that it just has to make sense for the business, and most importantly, what the reports say. So in this case, for one of our clients with a more sophisticated journey, that prospect, by, in this case, their CRM Salesforce, by Salesforce lingo, stays a lead for the entire journey. But they have each stage mapped out. We're going to know how long each stage that prospect stays in, if it's 2 days, 5 days a week, whatever. And we can monitor, measure, and pull reports to say 1,000 people entered this week. We've got 200 that have moved through to this stage and that stage. And so it's all transparent and visible. So who cares if it's really a lead, an op, or whatever? We can measure it. And that's the most important thing. So I think it's important not to get hung up on what is it, and more about, can you measure it?
Right.
right?
Is it moving toward your objective?
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
really
I think
about
it's very
remaining.
difficult to do, right? I think that you plan these things out and they, if you've gone through a solid planning exercise like we're discussing today, where you do have some spreadsheet or probably a combination of the spreadsheet and the diagram starting point that we would use that calls out stages and objects and downstream and upstream and all these types of things so that, as the business and as the people that are thinking through this stuff evolve, then you can say, well, actually, what that does mean that we'll have to have this touch point and that we will need to do a data integration here, or we will need a web developer over there, or whatever those things are. That all needs to come together in that format. But for customers that I think, that are lucky enough to be on something like a Salesforce pure play across the board, it's not going to be easy. I mean, we know that it's going to be a lift no matter what. But if you're not on that type of an environment, it becomes like almost that much more challenging now to sort of stitch these pieces together in a legacy environment to really understand where are people at, like, and is this sort of working? Is it benefiting? And if you don't, to Riley's point, have, good buy-in, everybody's just going to sort of throw their hands up eventually and say, oh, this isn't working, or, why am I doing yet another thing? I'm already busy enough. I don't want to check this tab, right? So I think that, this has been, do we have anything else we want to throw in there? I mean, essentially what we're saying is, you need to do your planning, start with the right people in the room that probably are part of the entire, any touch point in the business.
Have a well-defined goal for what you're actually trying to do so that you can break that down by stages and steps.
And measure it.
Right, and those might be multiple goals, multiple stages, and they're not all going to be tackled at once.
Yeah.
And it's completely agile. There are going to be changes that come up 6 months from now that you never even thought would exist.
Yeah.
That is a guarantee.
And then downstream, know all these, as a methodology of a true kind of end-to-end planning process for the rest of the systems and tools that would be part of enabling this journey, to be able to then say, yeah, well, this is what was approved, and now we will add data. We will start collecting this. It will change policies and customer service. It will mean that we're doing things slightly different. It will drive an IT project. It will drive a Salesforce, or it will drive an integration. I think that that's one of the huge values of painting this bigger picture for companies, is that they can then use it as a tool to really move that process forward instead of it being an IT project or a customer service project. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that was great, Alex. Thank you.
No problem.
2 in a row.
Should we introduce who Alex is?
Everybody knows who Alex is. He's super popular. Yeah,
Alex
he knows
is
it.
our producer, director,
Yeah.
technical wizard, and wearing many goose hats.
So keep tapped in. This is when we're pumping content out. I mean, I don't know. We have to be one of
we
the
have a
top.
lot to say.
We've got 6 going. I mean, we're pumping these out on literally every week. It seems like. I'm just kidding. We got to amp the content up, Kev. We got to be pumping these out. But like
we
and
have content
subscribe and
manager.
share. We're going to be running a contest for a free iWatch, maybe.
Are we still filming?
I don't know. Yeah, we are.
Or at the very least, like a water bottle.
At the very least, one of our water bottles provided by our
camouflage baseball
customer.
hat.
One of our customers, Condo Advertising Connections, sponsoring the podcast today. No, just kidding. Well, kind of they are. Anyways, thank you very much. Episode 6 done.